Hello friends, my name is JJ. So the other day I read this amazing book called The 90s by Chuck Klosterman, who is one of my favorite authors. It is a really incredible history of just how different American culture was 25 years ago. And a big part of Chuck's thesis is that we can now clearly state that the 1990s were the critical decade marking the transition between the modern, computer-driven world that we all inhabit today and the much more technologically limited world of the 20th century. At one point, he says that having conscious memories of the 1990s might be the most important generational dividing line in American culture, since being able to remember the 1990s basically means being able to remember the very different rhythm of life that defined the previous century, and thus being able to appreciate the modern world with the appropriate mix of gratitude and wonder. Let me read you this great passage from the book's first chapter. It is hard to explain the soft differences between life in the 2020s and life in the 1990s to any person who did not experience both of these periods as an adult. Far more difficult than explaining the day-to-day difference between life in 1960 and 1990. For the most part, the dissonance between the 60s and the 90s involves how things were designed, manufactured, and packaged. A teenager in 1960 would purchase physical music on a circular polyvinyl record. The 1990 version of that teenager would purchase physical music on a circular polycarbonate disc. The cost of a record in 1960 was around $3, which accurately translated to $13.25 in 1990 dollars. That evolution is easy to comprehend, unlike the profound structural dissonance between consumer life in 1990 and consumer life in 2020. A person native to the 21st century can't really reconcile why anyone would pay $13.25 for 12 fixed songs that could only be played on specific high-end electronics serving no other function. The majority of all recorded music can now be instantly accessed anywhere for less than $10 a month. For those who experience both paradigms firsthand, the explanation for why the former did not seem idiotic is both simple and abstract. That's just how it was. For those who missed that era entirely, the difference is so maddening that it barely justifies consideration. This is not like the difference between driving a car and riding a horse. It's like the difference between building a fire and huddling in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise. Now, I was born in July of 1984, meaning that I did not become a legal adult until the summer of 2002. But in many ways, I don't think that being a teenager in the 90s was that different from being an adult in them, at least in the sense that you were old enough to be conscious of the world around you and how things in it worked, so to speak. I am already a pretty nostalgic person by nature, and as I get older, I find that I'm only spending more time reflecting on how different things have gotten since my day, which I guess is about the most stereotypical boomer thing an aging person can do, but I'm not ashamed. I think this sort of reminiscing is kind of fun and helps give you a useful perspective on the passage of time. I've made a few nostalgia-based videos in the past, and in today's, I thought I would just tell you a bit about some of my memories of what being a kid and a teenager in the 1990s was like, in contrast to how it is now. Given that some of my previous videos have focused more on the human side of the passage of time, today I thought we would focus more on the technological side. Technology is one of the big themes of this book, and reading it has pushed a lot of my own memories of this sort of stuff to the front of my mind. All right, let's go. So I basically went through my entire grade school education barely using computers. The first computer I ever remember seeing was the one that my second grade classroom had. It looked like this. The screen had only two colors, green and black, and it could only play a handful of very primitive educational games, which we were allowed to take turns doing once a week for like 15 minutes. This one was my favorite, a reading-based game called Word Munchers. You had to load up the games using one of these things, a plastic disc, and the whole process was so complicated that only the teacher could do it. Computers didn't even have mice in those days, so loading up a game meant having to type in special codes using the keyboard. Once a week, my grade school class would go down to the school's computer room, which was a special place where there were enough computers for everyone. One of my favorite and most dated memories of that place was that there was one computer in the room that had a full color screen, and all the kids would scramble like crazy to get to it when the teacher would open open the door. I remember thinking that the full color screen was so beautiful and high-tech, when in reality it looked like this. To a large extent, computers in those days were very much a novelty. It wasn't until my final year of high school that the teachers even started expecting us to hand in projects that had been typed and printed out with the computer, just because you couldn't take it for granted before then that every kid would have access to that sort of technology. Even by the time I graduated from high school, we were still doing weekly visits to the computer room, since computers were still considered exotic enough for teachers to have to formally teach us how to use them. By that point, we had upgraded to these things, the first generation iMacs, which had high resolution, full color screens and mice, and even an extremely slow version of this glamorous new thing known as the internet, which we will get to in a bit. Now, an interesting part of the culture in those days was this idea of a sort of person who was quote unquote good at computers. When I was in elementary school, for instance, there was this kid named Ryan in my class, and he was like the computer kid. His father was very into computers, and his family even had their own computer in their home. And this made him super knowledgeable about how computers worked, and everybody deferred to his computer knowledge, even the teachers. As time passed and it became more common for families to have a computer, Ryan's computers were always so much better than everyone else's. His computers were able to play these very sophisticated games with incredible graphics that blew everyone's minds, like this one game called Doom, where you shot these hideous monsters that bled real blood. That game was too scary for me. Now, the McCullough family was pretty indifferent to computers. Until the internet came along, it was pretty easy for a lot of people to consider personal computers kind of gimmicky and pointless, used more for entertainment than anything else. By the mid-90s, I already had multiple Nintendo systems, and I remember my father saying that that was enough computers for one house. Even though everyone sort of grasped that knowing how to work computers was going to be an important skill, a lot of people assumed it would be a much more specialized skill than it wound up being, with people like Ryan doing most of the work for us. We didn't end up getting a family computer until I was like in my final years of high school, meaning that I was still doing all of my written assignments by hand until I was like in grade 11. I can remember it seeming rather show-offy to me when kids would hand in their assignments that they had typed and printed on their home computers. It's like, ooh, la-dee-da, Mr. Technology Man. I remember having a particular resentment for this one girl in one of my classes whose family had a color laser printer. She seemed to take any available opportunity to print color pictures for her assignments, even when it didn't make any sense. Like it could just be a math assignment and she'd somehow figure out a reason to use her color printer for it. Now, one of the big things that turned little JJ off computers was typing, which just seemed like the most frustrating and complicated chore in the world to me. When I was in one of the early grades, I remember there was a few weeks in which they really tried to teach us how to type, and they brought in a bunch of these things, type-right plastic keyboards. They had this tiny little LED screen, just maybe big enough for a single word, and you would have to type those letters with your fingers all in the right place. And I found it so deeply frustrating and counterintuitive to learn that I never did. As I got older, they started to introduce us to more sophisticated typing programs that we could use on real computers in the computer room. Stuff like All the Right Type or the glamorous Mario Teaches Typing, but I struggled with these as well. The notion that I would someday be able to type entire paragraphs quickly and without looking at my fingers seemed about as far off as the idea that I would someday become a concert pianist. It still kind of shocks me at some level that I ever got over this and can now type large paragraphs with my fingers in the right place and not really think about it. I mean, now I can even type whole complicated sentences to my friends in seconds just using my thumb. But that also gets into how I finally wound up learning to type in the first place. One thing that I think Chuck Klosterman describes very accurately in his book was how often in the late 1990s you were told to care about this new thing called the internet. At a time when many people barely understood computers, the magazines and newspapers were all increasingly full of stories telling you to care about this very abstract technology called internet that was supposedly going to change everything. It's hard to imagine that there was a time in which the internet was considered something that was hard to understand, but it really was. I subscribed to Nintendo Power magazine as a kid, and I vividly remember this 2-page spread they had in their 1996 issue explaining to their child readers that there was soon going to be a Nintendo Power website. And I remember 12-year-old JJ just not understanding it at all. But it wasn't much different for adults. Really, the best modern analogy I can think of is how people react when someone is talking about blockchain today. The internet was sort of a similar thing in that some people really seemed to care a lot about it, but most people found it confusing or were even inclined to dismiss it as some sort of geeky fad for the Ryans of the world that surely wouldn't be relevant to normal people. My personal perceptions changed when I was about 15 or so, and my sister and I used to go to her friend's house after school. That family had a computer that was hooked up to the internet, and I remember that I was allowed to use it while the girls played. That was the first time that I actually got to see what the internet was. I was able to visit the Nintendo Power website, where I could very slowly download pictures of Nintendo characters or see incredibly small, blurry screenshots of new games that would allegedly be coming out sometime soon. I also got to use chat rooms for the first time. I guess chat rooms are sort of back now in the form of Discord, but when I was a kid, the hot thing was IRC, which was much less sophisticated. You would mostly just chat with random people in rooms that had no coherent theme or purpose. It was just considered fun to talk in real time with strangers from anywhere on Earth. I really liked chatting, and when our family eventually did get our own personal computer in the late 90s, I spent a lot of time using the latest chat apps that allowed you to talk one-on-one with your real-world friends, like AOL and ICQ. If it hadn't been for those, I probably never would have learned to type, which I do think says something about the degree that competence with technology is driven more by the perceived need of the user as much as any demand from larger society. So as you have no doubt picked up by now, Lil JJ was very into Nintendo. When I was quite young, I remember going to some Costco-like store with my mother and seeing a playable display of the original Super Mario Brothers and being so hypnotized by the visuals of it. The purple Goombas, for some reason, I just remember thinking were like the coolest looking things ever. I got an original Nintendo for Christmas of that year, and new video games and systems became the standard presents I would get for every Christmas and birthday. Obviously, to this day, a lot of kids' lives continue to revolve around video games, so I can't claim that I was special in that respect. But I do think in some ways video games were more of a unique phenomenon in the 90s, just because without the internet to supplement video game culture, video games were more exciting and mysterious. If you wanted to learn anything about video games, for instance, you had to read video game magazines. Like I said, when I was young, my parents got me a subscription to Nintendo Power magazine, which gave me access to information about video games that none of my other little friends had, and sometimes made me a bit cocky. Did you know they're making a new Mario game where you play as Yoshi and Mario is a baby? Did you know that if you press down Y, down, down Y, you can get unlimited lives in Donkey Kong Country? Yes, I was quite the cool kid on the playground, as you might imagine. Though I was always a bit resentful of kids who just got their video game news from rumors, which was the other big source of information in the pre-internet world. This is actually something that Chuck talks a lot about in his book as well. Not about video games specifically, but rather just the difficulty of verifying the accuracy of anything about anything in the pre-internet and certainly pre-smartphone age. As he says, it was harder to prove what was true. It was harder to disprove what was false. As a society, we've elected to ignore that many people of the 90s, many modern people, many of whom are still very much alive, were exceedingly comfortable not knowing anything for certain. Today, paraphrasing the established historical record or questioning empirical data is seen as an ideological, anti-intellectual choice, but until the very late 90s, it was often the only choice available. My nostalgia for video games is also very heavily bound up in nostalgia for that other great 90s institution, the video rental store. Renting a game or a movie was always the ultimate treat for a 90s kid, and it was a treat born from the physical limitations of entertainment media in those days. While it was exciting when your parents or the parents of your friends would take you to the rental store and let you pick out any game or movie you wanted to take home, it could also be incredibly upsetting to go all the way there, only to find that the only copy of Ghoulies 2 or whatever had already been checked out. I remember often phoning multiple video stores ahead of time as a kid to see if they had the thing that I wanted before we left, because my parents wouldn't want to waste time or have me get disappointed. And I remember that this unto itself could become a very time-consuming process, because of course back in those days, the smaller video stores didn't have a computer database of what was in or out. So the store guy would often have to put the phone down and actually go physically check the drawer or whatever, which is a good segue to 90s phone culture. So when I wanted to call these rental stores as a kid, I would have to flip through the yellow pages, the big phone number directory of all of the businesses in town, sorted by industry. There was also the white pages, which had the phone numbers of every person in town, in a way that seems kind of invasive by today's standards. But it was helpful because if you ever wanted to call a friend and didn't know what their number was, you would look up the father's name, because of course when I was a kid, no one had their own phone. There would just be a single shared phone for the whole family plugged into the wall, usually the kitchen. And as you know, the original internet used the phone line as well. So not only could only one family member use the phone at a time, only one family member could use the phone or the internet at a time. Cell phones had been around since the 80s, but were extremely expensive and rare, and I actually put off getting one as long as possible. It wasn't until my final year of college, in fact, that I got one, and even then I immediately gave it up when I moved to Japan in 2009. I proceeded to live an entire year abroad without having one. I mean, it just didn't seem that necessary. If I wanted to talk to my friends or my parents back home, I would just use a payphone out front of a corner store or something. In those days, it didn't seem weird to not be in constant communication with your friends at all times. Waiting until you got home to send them a Facebook message or whatever seemed fine. Of course, even in the old days, sometimes you were important enough that people had to get you on the phone right away. When I was a kid, my dad had an important job that I still don't fully understand, but it had something to do with helping process arrest warrants. And obviously people are getting arrested at all hours of the day or night, so they had to be able to contact him. And how did they do that before cell phones, you ask? Well, by calling his pager, of course. For those who don't know, a pager was a weird little machine that you would carry around with you and would send you a message when someone was trying to call you. But of course it couldn't actually take calls, so you would just have to run to the nearest phone and call them back. A strong memory I have when I was a little kid is my dad getting a page when we were at the movies and him having to run out and call the judge or whoever on the payphone in the theater lobby. And then we'd have to go home so he could use the fax machine and send over the paperwork. Again, for any kids in the audience, a fax machine was this bizarre phone line contraption that people used to send documents to each other before email was invented. It's wild to think that the dads of today can just quietly do all of that stuff on a single handheld machine without ever leaving the theater. But get this, I actually have a legacy of 90s era phone culture permanently imprinted on my person. This is kind of a gory story, so trigger warning, but here it goes. One day, when I was a teenager, I was waiting for a very important phone call from my friend Oliver. I forget exactly what it was concerning, but it was some very important thing that I needed closure on. But much to my teenage chagrin, for some reason, my mother interrupted my waiting by the phone and forced me to leave the house to go out and do some errand with her. And the whole time I was out, I was just consumed with paranoia that I was gonna miss this important phone call from Oliver. And just as we were coming home and pulling into the driveway, I could hear the ringing of the phone coming from inside of the house. And so I bolted straight to the back door to our kitchen, which is where our phone was. Now the kitchen door was one of those doors that had a big window on the top half. And in my rush to answer the phone, I missed the doorknob and my arm went through the window. And it was very terrible, and now I have this big scar and a lasting memory of these sort of horrible atrocities that were possible back in those dark times before everyone had one of these things in their pocket at all hours of the day and night. So, those are some of my 90s memories. If you are my age, I would be curious to read some of yours in the comments. But if you don't have any conscious memories of the 90s, I would be equally curious to hear what aspects of the stuff we talked about today seem the most weird, exotic, or confusing to you. Old people like me like hearing about kids getting confused by stuff from the past. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next week.